here again. I enjoyed my trip to Nashville and seeing all of our brothers and sisters there, and it was a joy to worship with them and to give them a condensed version of the faith of Moses that we've been studying on Sunday evenings. So everything we've done up to this point in the year, I did for them in 5 lessons. So you can imagine there was a lot we didn't get into, but there was some beauty of what we did talk about. Appreciate Mark last week covering for class so that we could continue in Daniel chapter 7. In just a moment, we'll pick up in verse 19 again. I think there's a couple things I want to make sure we hit before we leave Daniel chapter 7. And then we'll get into, hopefully, the end of the book and then make any more observations about kingdom are. With that in mind, let's begin with a word of prayer before we go into the text. Our wonderful Father in heaven, the Ancient of Days, thank you for revealing your will and your truth, your wisdom and your nature to us, that we can look into the prophecies that Daniel has recorded and learn more about you, your faithfulness, your mercy, your justice, and to be comforted in knowing that your plans will always come true. That there is not a single word that you speak that you will not back by action. God, you will do all things that you intend to. Help us to understand that and never forget how important it is to rely on you and your truth. That we would survive all of the changes of this life and strive after the kingdom that is established forever. It's in your most holy name that we pray, and it's through your Son that we come before your throne. Amen. All right, Daniel chapter 7, let's pick up verse 19 again and dive right in. Enjoyed the conversation you had about Rome last week. Some interesting information. But let's see what else we left behind here in 19 through 24. Or through 25. Then I desired to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. And about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell. The horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than its companions. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came. And judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, as for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down, and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. All right? Give you just about a minute to reflect on that, the text, and then we'll talk about your observations or questions. All right. What do you notice here? What questions or observations do you have? Gary.
Just because no one else has said anything.
I'm telling you, I can wait longer in silence than y'all
I'm
can.
sure.
I will win that fight.
Well, it's good to notice that the sentence is here, the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. So that's interesting.
Yeah. I think that's one of the main pieces that this dream is actually pointing to and this interpretation is pointing to. You know, we get caught up in these kings, and certainly Daniel was too. He goes, I wanted to know what this fourth king was all about. But then he goes in verse 22 and says, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. All right, so now we have a shift in power, a massive shift in power. Lisa has a comment here. And that shift is from these kings and these kingdoms that are of the earth to a kingdom that is possessed by saints, as we talked about last time as well.
Well, there's a concern that people use this to justify their thinking as far as the 1,000-year reign and the tribulation and Christ coming to earth and ruling in Israel, and then coming back for a second time.
Sure.
So how do we combat that thought process?
Okay.
Using this text for that purpose.
All right. We have a couple comments. Like names. I come back and names are gone. Yes. Why can't I think?
The way you combat it is the end of Daniel, because they won't open the book until everything is done.
Yeah.
So if you take them to the end of Daniel, to that verse where the book will not be opened until everything comes to pass, then you have to know that everything has come to pass, so the book is open and we can read it for ourselves.
Certainly, that is a piece of it. Ida had another thought up here. No? You're withholding the wisdom. All right. Let's go. I think a bit to that point is the fact that these things are going to be sealed up until the time when they've been completed. We also see, though, that this is speaking of specifically a time when you have this kingdom, still not clear based on the text which kingdom this is, right? We often are going to tie it to Rome, and there's a lot to point to that, and I think that is ultimately where we go with it. One of the things, though, is that the saints possess the kingdom. So there's this idea that the saints are going to be entering into this kingdom and possessing it. There's not this period where they're in waiting for that to happen. Here he's saying there's a shift of power, there's a change of leadership and of a kingdom from that earthly to the spiritual, and that happens when this fourth beast is conquered. Now, this can't be completely by itself used to prove all the things they want, nor can it be used completely by itself to disprove everything. There's a number of verses they'll run to try to weave that narrative, and so this is just one of those. In fact, one of the verses that they typically will use is going to the end of verse 25 that we just read through, which is that they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. What does that mean? What does that mean? A long time? Okay. 3.5 years. So that would be a time being a year, times being 2 years, and half a time being half a year. That'd be 3.5 years. But not forever. And so the more important idea here is not that it is defining a specific number of years and days, but that it is God saying, I will have a specified allotment of time in which they will be in his hand. It is my determined time. And there are many things that line up to that in Scripture where it'll look like 3.5 years, but there's many parts of that that don't exactly work into all the narrative. So that's one of the challenges of dealing with a prophetic dream like this. There are messages that are being told that are not going to be specific to days and weeks and months. That it's the concept, it's the understanding behind it. Like in this case, it is a specified time under the control of the Almighty, the Ancient of Days, who says it will happen, and I will end it. There will be a time where it comes to an end. Any other thoughts on that? Michi?
I know that we're in the historical context, but I love application.
Yep.
And so I like to see 21 as 22 and 22 as very timeless, because the world is always waging war with the saints today, us, and we are trying to uphold that image of God as best we can. And I think 22 really does give us that reassurance and comfort that, Jesus is coming back. So I love that we see it in the historical context where we do see how God always wins. And I think this also gives us that comfort for today where, there is a history, but this is also so timeless too. And just keep on keeping on and keep the faith.
Yeah, and in that sense then, kind of going with that idea that this is, the saints have been given the kingdom. If that's us right now, we're still being oppressed. We're still having war waged against us, as you mentioned. So what's our times and half a time? 3.5 years? That's it? We got 3.5 years more? We're good to go? No, but it's a specified time in which God will put it to an end. And then we'll get the full glory of what he's talking about here. Certainly we see a very physical application at the time of Rome, but then we see the more overarching, long-lasting application that Michi's referring to. And so we can take comfort in that because God is in control. We have access to the kingdom, and the oppression will end. It's not going to be forever. Okay, what else do you notice in the text here? Aaron?
Not in the text, but in just
Sure.
what you were, making the application and applying it to today. I think the victory that we ultimately have is over sin, and we're not under the oppression of the slave master,
Right.
of Satan, and he has been conquered, and we have received that victory, and we have that today.
Yeah, we do have that confidence that Satan is conquered and ultimately will be conquered in the end. That even though he's oppressing us in some ways, we're not under his reign. We're under the reign of the kingdom and the king who reigns victorious. Okay, anything else in that section? Yeah. Tom.
Well, I had kind of a question. So you kind of hinted, so it's that the saints possess the kingdom in verse 22.
Yes.
The time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. So in verse 14, where to him, being the Ancient of Days, it says, was given dominion and a glory and a kingdom. So are we talking about the same kingdom, or how do we reconcile the two?
What do you see as the two kingdoms, just to make sure I'm on the same page
Well,
as
that's
you?
what I'm wondering. Is like, are we referring to the same kingdom, or are they two different kingdoms, or how do we reconcile that it's given to the Ancient of Days and then given to the saints?
Sure. So what's happening in 14 is you have that he is given dominion, control, and glory, and the kingdom. Okay, so he's raised up on high. This is Jesus being given authority over the kingdom as king. That all peoples, nations, languages should serve him. So here's all of humanity has access to come and worship and be part of his kingdom. now he goes into this description of what's happening as with the fourth beast, and he's saying, look, it looks like he's going to conquer. It looks like he's reigning victorious, and then what's going to happen? The Ancient of Days comes in, and he wipes out that fourth beast, and then you have him giving that same kingdom to all the saints of the Most High. So while in 14 he's saying all nations will come and have access before him, he's clarifying then in 18 and also in 22 and then again in 27 that those who are actually receiving the kingdom are the ones who are saints or the holy ones of the Most High. They've been set apart as different from the rest of the world. And so, of course, we don't want to inherit a kingdom that's without a king. Right? That's just chaos. That's absurdity. And so what he's saying is there's an established king over this kingdom that reigns forever, and all nations can come into it, but only the ones who submit to him as king are going to be in it. And they'll receive the kingdom as well. They'll possess it. They'll live in it. They'll enjoy all the benefits of it. Does that help? Any further questions?
Yeah, I guess so. Is the idea then that like we rule together? Is that, you know, because if you possess a kingdom, like is that what you think?
Yeah, that we're actively reigning as priests. We're actively, you know, coming together as a church to be the kingdom that the world sees, so that they would come in line and have access to the kingdom as well. Aaron had a thought there, though.
Yeah, and the analogy used in the New Testament is the bridegroom and the bride.
Yeah.
And that we are, you know, as the church, we are the bride of Christ, and he comes, and, you know, so it is this kingdom is one that is shared, and, you know, we're kind of with Christ.
Yeah.
In a real different way than kingdoms of this time that we're reading about here ruled. It was very oppressive and authoritarian.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is a relationship, and it's a partaking, and it's a family.
Yeah, good. I like that. Okay, anything else in that section? Lisa had something.
Sorry for so many questions.
I mean, I think this section does that. There's
Yeah.
just tons here.
Well, the 10 horns or 10 kings will arise from this kingdom. Another king different from the previous ones will rise after them and subdue 3 kings.
Yes. Well, you don't just get to ask a question like that. Load it with some more. Come on. What do you? I mean, is there a thought that you're wrestling with there?
Well, I try to connect it to Rome,
Sure.
of course, because they had successively, they remind me a little bit of Israel when they were going into captivity,
Sure.
that they had good kings and bad kings.
Absolutely.
The Caesars, and some were more horrific than others, and
Sure.
some were more kindly towards the Jews and the Christians.
Okay.
But some, we know Nero and Vespasian and,
Sure.
all these were, Domitian, they were really awful. To me, they're the 3 terrible, but I just wonder about who are the 3 kings that they take over. Is that Nebuchadnezzar and Alexander and the Persian kings Darius, Cyrus?
Yeah. And so this is where things get interesting. We'll tread there a little bit. It would take all of this class and about 5 more to go through all the options, right? And all the attempts that people have made to tie these to specific things. But I'm going to let this develop before maybe coming back and circling it around. Kay had a thought, and we'll see what happens after that.
Well, Rome was an earthly kingdom, and the kingdom that the saints inherit is going to be a spiritual kingdom.
Okay, so at least clarifying as we look at Rome, it is an earthly kingdom. And then it has, as you pointed out, Lisa, these kings that are reigning, but they're not perfect, and so there's this shifting of power and all these things going on. Ida, may I ask you to talk through the options you mentioned, just as simply as you did before class that we were talking about? I don't normally call on people, but you have more study on this. I am not a history buff, so just some of the options that people have thrown out here.
Well, basically, the term king was one that the Romans didn't like at all, and they felt that they didn't really have any good kings except for Numa, the first king. And that's why they got rid of their kings, and there were 7 of them. And then there were a series of people that took over the republic, Sulla, the Gracchi brothers, and then, of course, most famously, Julius Caesar. And then after that, you have a person coming up, and we use the term emperor, which they never used. It was imperator, which sounds a lot the same, but it's really the first among citizens, or the first citizen, which was also used when the French revolted. They had their first citizen. And this, and when you think about the Caesars, which is why I think that we equate that with this passage, is that they did speak great things, and Caesar did change the calendar, or Julius Caesar changed the calendar. And so anyways, to me though, it's not one particular emperor, but it's the whole type of government that they were under. Does that?
Yeah, and just for clarity, that last one that rises after Julius, that one that comes along, who would that be?
Augustus.
Augustus, okay.
And the other emperors.
Sure. And then the whole emperors to follow. Yeah, and there's certainly, I mean, we could, like I said, walk down that path for quite some time. Michi has a comment, and then I'll see what about wrapping that idea together here.
I don't know if this is a right thought, but like God exists outside of time. And I think it's helpful to try to pinpoint it to one thing, but also realize is that history does repeat itself, because when humanity doesn't follow the way, they're just going to continue on the same path. So I think it could be everything and just one person all at the same time. I think it's the people of the past that Daniel was dealing with and the people of today. And I think it's helpful to pinpoint how this specifically goes to different ages, and we can learn from the mistakes of others.
Yeah.
But I also really do believe that for me personally, I do myself a disservice to only pinpoint it to one thing. It's helpful to understand it for this story, but also realizing that how do we see that around us today, so that way we can hold on to God, because he really is super timeless. Well, he is timeless. You know, he exists outside of that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think that's what Ida was alluding to at the end of her comments, was the idea that this is not just a specific king and set of kings, but it is an identification of all types of rules that come through, and the cycle of rulers that come into a kingdom or a country or whatever that is. And to your point, it still can be played out today in terms of how we see that power develop. Now, I think from a biblical standpoint, let's kind of reason that through a little bit. I was talking to Ida beforehand when she made those comments, and they're valid. That is where we can see a lot of this tie to Rome. Think of it a different perspective. He's using numbers here. What is 10 in the Bible? We've talked about this before. What is 10? Do you remember? 10 is not complete. That's 7. 10 is not complete. 10 is a testing or identity of humanity. Okay? So if we have 10 kings, what is he showing us through numerology? This is a display of human reign. This is a testing of human kingdoms and human kings. And so you have 10 of them, and they should show you what humanity would do if they reign. And what happens? Another one comes on that thinks he's better than all humanity who's come before him, who thinks he's going to be able to do this far better, so much so that he takes out 3. 3 is a symbol of God and his perfection, and that is what he does. What does he do when he comes into reign? That 1. He also speaks words against the Most High, verse 25. He wears out the saints of the Most High. He's trying to displace, and even in what Ida was mentioning, you see this. So they had the 7 kings that then became the 3 who thought they were better. We aren't kings. We don't do that. We're better. We're a perfect version. We're the 3. And then comes 1 who thinks he's better. And that's humanity. Look at any kingdom we have today. Any nation, any country, the next ruler comes along, and what do they think? I'm better than everything that came before. And that's why then Daniel's vision wraps up in verse 26 through the end, and he says this: "But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him." Here is the end of the matter. "As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart." Take a moment to reflect on that. We can talk about the 10 kingdom, the 10 and the 7 and the 3 and all that as well in just a moment. But reflect on 26 through the end of the chapter, and then we'll talk about your observations. Daniel chapter 7, 26 through 28. All right, what do you notice there? What questions do you have? Scott is back here this time.
It starts with "but," which, made me look at what is the "but."
Yeah.
But the court sits in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away. So the court was there all along, watching and waiting, allowing for a time. I just like the image of God never took his eyes off. He was there all along. Justice was always there, and that he takes care of it.
Yeah.
Though he allowed it, and what it did, even for Daniel, it left him with 2 things. One, trusting in God and waiting, all with all this concern and stress in a situation.
Sure.
But it also creates faith that there's hope.
Sure.
He offers hope, and there's something to wait for, and so you just see that God was there and he was in control, and I just really need to see that he's watching and protecting and cares, and he's got a better plan than what we see humans
Absolutely.
being able to accomplish, you know.
Yeah, that even in the midst of watching all the destruction by the various beasts, and even this one, especially this one, that is so overwhelmingly wicked that the image of it can't even be described. And as we talked about, that which we can't describe or understand is often the scariest thing to us. And we see the destruction that he creates according to the interpretation of the vision, and Daniel's certainly anxious. But as Scott points out, he's also keeping in his heart these last few verses, which is that will be judged. And the kingdom will be established that lasts forever. There's an end to that destruction. And so he's got to put that faith in the Most High or in the Ancient of Days to be able to endure whatever trials come. Okay, what else do you notice? Michi?
I like that Daniel didn't freak out. Even though he was scared and he said that his face changed, he kept it in his heart. And I think it's cool to see that God trusted Daniel with this vision. And Daniel was like, all right, I know this is intense, but he didn't go around instilling fear into other people, trying to tell them, hey, I had this thing and blah, blah, blah. He kept it to himself and allowed God to work. And when it came time for Daniel to speak up, God placed him in those positions, as we see in the book, to be able to speak for God on his behalf about those things. And I think that that's really cool.
Yeah, and I think the fact that Daniel doesn't turn around in this and start talking about how he spread the word goes back to Scott's point. It was for him. This was just as much for him as it was for us today. That Daniel is now, he's, I got to go back and look at my dates here. He's about 11 or 12 years away from seeing the people go back to Jerusalem. There's still destruction all around him. He's only in the first beast. He's still in Babylon. He's still in Babylon at this point. That's not been conquered. And so he's seeing all this destruction, and he's probably starting to think the words of his prayer that he's going to give in chapter 9, how long? How long is this going to continue? How long are we going to continue to have these kingdoms reign over us and treat us so poorly? And God says, well, it's going to get worse. There's going to be more kingdoms that come and conquer. Humanity is going to be oppressed. And then when God comes, he's going to establish his kingdom, and the saints will rise up. But even then, they'll be oppressed. They're going to have the pain. They're going to endure just like you did, Daniel. But in the end, judgment. Judgment. Judgment of all wickedness and setting straight everything that is right. Go ahead, Gary.
Well, I was just thinking, we've said it a lot of times, but it just makes me think we can't really blame anyone for not understanding that the kingdom was not going to be an earthly kingdom.
Yeah.
We read all these things, and that's all that had ever existed, ever, were earthly kingdoms, right? And I'm not sure we can find anyone that it explains that they understood perfectly that the kingdom of heaven was completely spiritual, in the beginning anyway.
Yeah.
Came
Now,
to understand.
sure. I'm going to let Ida make a comment here, and then I might have take us back there for Gary.
This is kind of a repeat of a comment that I made last time, but I think touching on what Michi said, this shows Daniel's concern for humanity and for others. And, well, if the kingdom of God was going to triumph, well, why was he alarmed? And why does this come? Well, because even though it's a spiritual kingdom, all of this struggle is taking place in the physical realm. And this means that people are going to be hurt, and lives are going to be uprooted, and things are going to change. And that is a lot to ask of a civilization or people. So anyways, I think that this is showing his humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. His care and concern for humanity. And I think to Gary's point, one thing in the text that should have called Daniel and all those who would go back and interpret it through the years to consider that this was not an earthly kingdom is verse 27. The kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms of the under the whole heaven. So he's putting two things at odds with each other. You have the whole greatness of the kingdoms of heaven, under heaven, right? So everything on earth, those kingdoms, that greatness. And then you have the kingdom that he's talking about. Well, if it's not under the earth, because it's not described there by all the greatness of the kingdoms under the heavens, where is that kingdom he's talking about? Where is that dominion he's talking about? Well, then it has to be in heaven. They should have understood these things, that the kingdom God would establish was a heavenly kingdom. But they looked right over that. They got caught up in, who's the beast? What is the beast? How does this all play out? And they lost sight of the hope that Scott reminded us of. Gary and then Lisa.
Just real quick, well, we're in the kingdom while on earth, and it will never end. It goes to heaven, but we're in the kingdom on earth, right?
Yes, and if we look specifically, we've kind of been blurring the lines a bit here this morning. The initial playing out of these prophecies comes when? Who is the Son of Man that comes and causes judgment against that kingdom? Jesus. Which also ties us to Rome, right? He's there during the Roman rule. And so from that standpoint, the kingdom is established. And then we see the more eternal promises of this, which is we get to be in that kingdom forever. And this is going to be where we pull some of this imagery to us and say, looking forward, where's our hope? Well, judgment's coming again. He's going to do all of that again. And in fact, we'll talk about that this morning in our lesson.
Well, to the defense of Daniel and other people who didn't understand that this meant a spiritual kingdom and not a physical one, the apostles didn't even understand that. The apostles questioned, when's this going to happen? Who's going to be first?
Right.
What's going to, and they put everything in. They really didn't understand until Jesus rose.
Right.
And the Holy Spirit came on them that this wasn't a physical kingdom that they were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Barry has a comment here.
Well, I think something that sort of pictures this is that there in Damascus, there was a temple erected, a heathen temple erected in the 1st century.
Okay.
And then in the 5th century, it was converted into a church.
Mm.
And then in the 8th century, it was converted into a mosque.
Mm.
But even though it's been there as a mosque for 1,200 years, there's still an inscription in it that says, Jesus' kingdom is forever and his dominion will never perish.
Yeah. Which is the overarching theme of this chapter. Yeah, and even those inscriptions stand in places where they've tried to conquer the church and conquer the kingdom of God, but they are reminded daily of the fact that it lasts forever and it's going to endure forever. All right, to scratch the itch of those of you who want to see all of this imagery come to life, we'll quickly run through before next week we'll jump into chapter 8. But as we were talking about the beast, let's look at the lion with the wings. This we would typically call Babylon, and let's look at why this makes sense in many ways. This is a paralleling back to chapter 2, if you'll remember. We have our chiastic structure from chapter 2 to chapter 7. 2 and 7 mimic each other. They mirror each other. And so Babylon's the golden head in chapter 2, which then makes sense. The first is the lion here is then Babylon. And a lion was its symbol. As we talked about as we opened up chapter 2 and we were talking, or chapter 1 and talking about Babylon and Daniel going into Babylon, we'll pull that up here in just a second. Here's the Ishtar Gate. And what was one of the tile works that they put all over the gate going into Babylon? It was a lion. Now, is that rock solid proof and that's the only proof we have? No, there's other images that come to life through the use of this. But you can see how God is even using potentially the imagery that they found to be their glory and using it and saying, yeah, that's not even enough. My kingdom's going to destroy that as well. And so you can see this lion then having that same resemblance. And of course, chapter 4, we see that he is broken and set up. And that's the same idea as his wing is broken. And then he's set up on 2 legs and he's given dominion again. And he's given that the mouth of a man, I believe was what he said in chapter 4. Going into the bear with the bones in his mouth, we'll actually get confirmation of the Medo-Persian rule in chapter 8. He literally will say, this animal is the Medes and Persians. So we get confirmation that the Medes and Persians are part of this equation. That would equate to chapter 2 with the silver chest. And being raised on one side, the Persians were the more powerful force in that dynamic duo. And so is that he's raised up on one side, showing that there's the one that is grounded is the more powerful. Others are saying that him striking is the idea of him raised up, ready to strike. Again, interpretation, but the idea being it's a kingdom, and it's going to have a reign and a rule. The bones, maybe without wings, symbolizes that he devours and only conquers what's already established. And the Medes and Persians don't actually push the boundaries out too much from what they conquer, so they don't need the wings to be swift to conquer. I mean, there's all sorts of fun you can have looking into these things, as long as we keep in mind the original message that we talked about this morning. God's kingdom will be established, and it will reign forever, no matter who these kings and kingdoms are. You have the leopards, which would be the Greeks, also confirmed in chapter 8. They are the bronze, middle, and thigh in chapter 2. And potentially, Alexander the Great's 4 generals divide the kingdom after he's done. And so there's that 4-headed beast. Is that the 4 heads that then lead to the demise of the kingdom? Potentially. And then, of course, the one we've been talking about, having Rome with its legs and feet of iron and clay in chapter 2. Well, that's transformed into the iron teeth in the beast in Daniel chapter 7. Extremely powerful is one of the descriptors that we use. And certainly they conquered more of the earth and more kingdoms and more lands than any other kingdom that had come before them. Not only that, but they induced fear, which this beast did for Daniel. And as y'all talked about last week, and as we think about Rome, that'll be the last thing I pop up there. So if you want the picture, there it is. But the fear-inducing is they used the wicked punishments. They were wicked in how they treated people. They were not kind or pleasant. It was a powerful reign that induced fear in many. And so we see this imagery, and we can see how it relates to kings and kingdoms that would follow. And we can even see how it relates to kings and kingdoms we see today. I mean, Nazi power followed many of these images. Russian power at certain times have followed this imagery. United States at times has exuded some of this imagery. These are earthly kingdoms. No matter where we are, no matter what's going on, no matter what the kingdoms around us do, the end of the matter is still the same. That the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, and his kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. All right? So we'll move on to chapter 8. We'll get more into the Medo-Persian and Greek at that point. If you want to geek out over all the unique ties between the biblical text and how it actually plays out in these kingdoms, let me know. Maybe we can have a side conversation at some point, but we need to keep moving in Daniel, so we'll keep in the text as much as we can. Appreciate your comments and attention, and we'll take a short break and then join for our services.